This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Nomad Century, the new book from Gaia Vince, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. Here in the 21st century, we're looking at some very towering statistics that warn that what we accept as a climate today is not the climate of the near future, 2050 and 2100. And Gaia Vince's book, for which I congratulate her, takes us into the future with an extremely happy twist of the technology and the will of the people of the earth. I begin, however, with reports from the most recent meeting, people worrying about climate change, to characterize what work Gaia has done for us to imagine the future. One such executive from science and the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi, attending COP27 in Cairo, Egypt, said, "The negotiations that are happening are completely devoid of reality." Another critic of the conditions of the world meeting, 45,000 people coming together to discuss between Cairo and Sharm el-Sheikh, the resort, what is to be done. Another critic said, "I have never seen anything like this. We've reduced the whole thing into a grand spectacle." It is not a grand spectacle. And I begin with an example that Gaia gives us of migration already underway. The man's name is Arable. He lives in a rural part of Peru. And one day he's given the opportunity to move to Lima, better jobs and education for his children. However, the whole thing is something of a sham. He shows up with money and polyethylene sheets in what will become his home. It's a sand pile at the edge of Lima. He's about to become part of the slums of the global south. Gaia, congratulations and good evening, and thank you very much. What do we learn from Arable, from his disappointment and his ambition? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's such a pleasure to join you on this. Yeah, I mean, I use this example actually because when we talk about migration, we talk about people moving. Of course, people move for all different reasons. But there are people that help this. You know, this is something that is very much underway. It's already happening. I mean, my book projects through to the rest of the century, but I want to make it clear that climate migration is already happening. It is inevitable now, and it will only increase. So Arable is he was a farmer. I met so many people actually in Latin America, and particularly in South America, in the Andes and the Bolivian and Peruvian Andes, who can no longer farm. I mean, most of their drought has been a huge problem. A lot of them rely on either glacial meltwaters from glaciers that have long since disappeared, or some precipitation, which is just not happening anymore. And they are desperate. They are leaving. These villages have been depopulating for the past at least 2 decades. But I thought what was quite interesting about Arable is that we got an insight into the mechanism by which a person leaves the security of their home village, where their ancestors live, where their family is, where they own land, where they have a life, pitiful as that is, you know, to move to a completely different place where they know nobody and they have nothing. And there are people, you know, essentially, I guess they're migration coordinators. They're essentially people traffickers who basically prepare a bit of land where the landowner is away, and then get people together, desperate people from the villages, who pay them, and then they are taken to this land to squat on it. And what it means is that people who have no choice have to make a life in these slums. Lima, is the biggest desert city outside of Cairo. It's absolutely massive. It never rains there at all. It's extremely dry. They rely on water in the city proper. The wealthy part of the main city of Lima, they have piped water. But the people that live in these slums outside, and they are literally sort of plywood or polythene sheet one room houses with a plank for a roof and a hole dug in the middle of the floor for a latrine. You know, they rely on trucks to provide water, which is, of course, a much more expensive way of getting your water. And then they have to, you know, they have to get hooked up to electricity. They're living basically in an uninhabitable place. And this is what I've witnessed in the last sort of 2 decades, these growing slum communities that are really living these terribly precarious existences on the edges of cities, because they're climate migrants. They can't exist there, but the life they have in the city slums, is also becoming more and more vulnerable because of climate change. And these people will move. Of course they will.
Yes, the global south is moving north. The overwhelming statistics show this. I just mentioned that the way the Earth has built itself these last several 100 million years, the dominant part of the landmass is in the North Temperate Zone, the world island of Eurasia, where Gaia lives, and the New World where I live in North America. So the move that we see as migrants or immigrants or aliens in the Central America, or leaving North Africa to take the risks of the Mediterranean, or leaving France to take the risks of the North Sea, that's the global south moving north. What are the threats? Gaia gives us a new 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, already experienced in Australia: fire, heat, flood, and drought. Did I get that right, Gaia?
Yes, I mean, I call them the 4 horsemen of the Anthropocene, because this is the age dominated by humans, this very changed world that we're already living in now, with higher temperatures and increased human population and resource scarcity. It's a very different world from the ones that our ancestors were lucky enough to live in, this very stable Holocene. And yes, these 4 horsemen, the fire, drought, heat and floods, these are what threaten people, their property, their livelihoods, and make the journey somewhere else a necessity. So, you know, it's a push and a pull. So people who are living in geographically more dangerous areas, and that's basically the tropics, this band of increasing climate impacts that spans the equator and some degrees of latitude north and south of that. They are they're experiencing the most dangerous climate effects in terms of these 4 horsemen already. People living on coastlines, who are experiencing more severe extreme storms and erosion and sea levels rise. On the edges of river deltas, and these are some of our most major cities. So they are inevitably going to, as the tropics become more dangerous, more unlivable, and to some degree they're already in many places unlivable for months of the year, they are going to move to higher latitudes. And if you look at the globe, you'll see immediately that the most land, you know, they're sort of ice cream cone shapes, the continents of Africa and the Americas. The most land is north. And so, you know, everywhere on Earth will be affected by this changing climate, by this more extreme weather. But the far north will still be more habitable than the tropics, and largely a lot of those places are wealthier and able to adapt, much more able to adapt to these conditions. And so that's where people are going to move.
What can go wrong and why? The book is Nomad Century: How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. Gaia Vince is the author, and we turn to migration itself and borders. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. We begin with the migrants of the global south needing to move because of the 4 horsemen of the Anthropocene, which is the debatable era replacing Holocene as where we live right now. However, what can go wrong and why? We know it. It's in the news already. Borders, or the interception of human traffickers in the Mediterranean or in the North Sea, turning back people who are looking for anything better than where they're coming from because of climate change and because of bad governance. Bad governance and climate change tend to go together. It might be a phenomenon, it might be a one-to-one correlation. but I mentioned the fact that we're all migrants. Gaia, it's not only my family and all of our families here in America. Reading through a history of Julius Caesar, he built his reputation on his brutality towards the tribes of Germany and France that were moving in Gaul, that he slaughtered them in great number and bragged about it back in Rome. We've been moving for thousands of years, and it's determined our histories. But borders were important to the Romans. Borders are important here in North America. What needs to be done about borders? How do we rethink our borders?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. We've been moving not just hundreds of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, we're an ape that evolved in somewhere in Africa 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And look at us now. We live literally everywhere. We've colonized the globe, and we did that through migration, and we did it through exploiting the human networks that we have across the world, and we all have those. We all know people from diverse parts of the world. That's 6 degrees of separation, and that's how people move. They move through connections that they have. And at the moment, we recognize that for economic productivity, we must increase the flow of goods, of money, of culture, of services, resources, all of those things. But weirdly, we limit the movement of our biggest economic resource, which is human labor. We put up these borders which stop that flow. And, you know, some economists reckon that we could at least double global GDP by just removing borders. Now, that's quite drastic. I don't know if we would be ready to do that or if it would be wise over the coming decades. But it's quite clear that the border restrictions we have reducing human mobility at the moment, many of which are actually very recent, certainly within the last sort of century or so, they're not fit for a world that is being rocked by this enormous global climate catastrophe, which is currently exploding everywhere around the world. We are going to have to rethink that. People are going to move, whether we like it or not. It's much, much better if we manage it, if we plan for this movement, and if we figure out a way to make this work to the advantage of everybody, to the advantage of host countries, countries of origin, and of course the people involved. And that does mean investment. It means investment financially in places that receive these cities that will need to expand. It means investment in housing, in adequate access to healthcare, to education, to all of those things that you want from your society. But it also means investment socially. This very, very key element means that we must invest in the idea that the migrants aren't bad people, that migration is not some aberration, that it's not morally wrong, that we all move. We need to invest in that, and we need to invest in this whole idea of inclusivity, of expanding our societies, of accepting this flux in population and making it work for us.
We have a legacy, however, that has brutality and cruelty. You very quickly summarize the U.S. Aliens Act of 1905, the U.S. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the White Australia policy that was in place until 1973, and the Immigrants Act of 1900 in the United Kingdom. So the North Temperate Zone has treated the Global South as if it is an unwanted creature, something that is invading us like a virus. That needs to change. Is it, Gaia? Is that being addressed by those who concern themselves with climate change?
It's absolutely not. And this is absolutely key to the problem that we face. I mean, at its heart, it's racism, it's tribalism, and it's generated by all sorts of different things, from fear of losing your job, fear of being overwhelmed by other people that want the same access to services, and so on. These are not the fault of the migrants. there is so much evidence now out there that migrants, they actually increase productivity. When it's managed well, they increase productivity of cities. They don't reduce wages, they actually raise them. They don't increase unemployment, they actually reduce it. They don't increase crime rates, they reduce it. There is so much evidence from across the world, from multiple cities in the United States, from Israel, from Europe, from across the world, that this is the case. But unfortunately, we are living in a time of increasing nationalism, of populist leaders, and this very worrying ethno-nationalism, this idea that a people belong to a place by merit of what they look like, of how much melanin they have in their skin. And first of all, this is biologically completely inaccurate. We are so closely related that there is no, that you can't tell where somebody's ancestors are from purely by looking at them anymore. And we're incredibly mixed up. But there is more genetic difference between two chimpanzees living either side of the Congo River than between two populations of people living on different continents. We are the same. We are the same. And we need to accept that. We also need to accept that migration is going to happen, and that it is largely going to be from the global south, who have largely darker skin than the people currently occupying most of the global north. So that is going to happen. To what degree it happens, and how it happens in terms of the disruption to our society, these are things that we can do something about. We need to challenge this anti-toxic, anti-migration narrative, this anti-refugee narrative, this idea that asylum seekers are criminals. It's firstly untrue, and secondly, it's poisoning our societies. It's very divisive. We need to challenge that, and I don't think it's being adequately challenged at all by centrist leaders, centrist parties, let alone by left-wing parties. I think there is a timidity in challenging that, and we need to address it, because it's, actual populations, when they're surveyed, are far less xenophobic than some of these leaders. Yes, we all recognize that our economies rely on immigration.
Your book made me smile, Gaia, because here in the United States, there's this discrimination between people who are refugees from abusive governments and what is called an economic refugee. I said, of course, an economic refugee. What are you thinking? The economy improves when they're here. Yes, we need 35 million workers before 2050 in the United States, or is it 2030? You need them in Britain as well. We need them across the entire global north and large parts of the world. Actually, we're facing a demographic crisis where people are just not having enough babies to support an elderly population. And the way to solve that is through immigration. Let's go to the new north that you build for us. Gaia Vince, the author of Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. I'm John Batchelor. We build the cities of the future. The global south is moving to the north. It is not stopping. It will continue for the balance of this century. We begin with an example that Gaia gives us that's quite wonderful about imagining a world, the undiscovered country of the future, where a farmer in Gujarat, India, who can no longer maintain his family because the soil becomes overheated, it is not as arable, drought is a constant problem. He applies for migration for he and his family. There's a form he fills out. He indicates what cities he'd like to move to and what he and his wife can do when they get there. There are obligations when you fill this form out. He asks for Ottawa. He asks for Manchester. However, he's assigned to Aberdeen, Scotland, a wonderful city dominated by fossil fuel in the 20th century. But here it is in the 21st century. And he and his wife have to promise to work when they get there for a job given them. He takes up work, she takes up work, the children go to school, and several years later, he's satisfies the work ethic that is required for a migrant, and then he thinking about starting a store to sell insulation with he and his partners. That is a success story that is commonplace in the United States. The only difference is that our hero is not a billionaire yet, which happens to migrants in the United States. However, Gaia, this is such a wonderful example. The part that doesn't exist yet is applying for a permission to migrate. What will that look like here in this century?
Yeah, so just to give a tiny bit of context for this, the idea really with this book is to open people's eyes to what really is happening this century. We are facing this this extreme change to our climate, which is going to force people to move, and it's going to be mass migration. It's going to be huge numbers, and that's going to change everything. So it's to open people's eyes to that and get them to start talking about it. But it's also to say, look, this is in our power to make choices. We can have a vision of the type of world that we want, the type of future that we want by the end of the century, and then make plans, make steps to get there through managing it. And that means facing head on what we are expecting in terms of heat, in terms of uninhabitable areas, in terms of the numbers of people moving, and then making a strategy to ensure that we do have productive cities. So that means cities in the north will have to be enlarged. We will have to build entirely new cities, and these people will have to move. How are they going to move? So there are millions of different ways, millions of different strategies of how that might move, how that might work. At the moment, it is completely catastrophic. It's inhumane. People are paying enormous amounts of money to people traffickers. They are drowning in the Mediterranean. They're being shot on the borders of the United States. I mean, it is horrific. It is inhumane, and that's a very small trickle compared to what we're expecting. So I suggest a United Nations new agency, a new body with real teeth that can help organize this among nations, among host nations and nations of origin, that can help allocate people via some sort of quota system to different jobs, to different areas. And this new body could also it would receive funding from the member states, but it would also allocate funding. So it would allocate funding to help with housing, to help with new industries in various places. You know, the Aberdeen of the future is not going to be crude oil anymore. It's not going to be that. It could be something else. It could be one of the big growth industries we're expecting this century, like biotechnology, like nature restoration projects, like new forms of agriculture. I mean, these are all going to be growth areas, as well as, of course, novel forms of energy, geoenergy, from new ways of harnessing the heat from the Earth's core itself. But that all of these industries need people, and these immigrants need to move to where jobs are, but they need to be included into that new society. So I suggest a mechanism which might reduce some of the hostile feelings that host societies might feel when new people arrive en masse. This idea that they have to, for the first few years when they arrive, they have to do jobs in the industries where they're needed. So that might be in services like care work, or in retrofitting houses for insulation, or energy, different types of energy production or energy use. You know, so it's this idea that they contribute to the society they're joining as part of a sort of inclusive package, and then they are free to move wherever they want, or to set up, become entrepreneurs, or join the labor force in some other way. You know, we do need to think about what it means to manage immigration, to make it successful, to make sure that the people arriving feel included in the society, and that the existing population doesn't feel overwhelmed and feels that those new citizens are part of the new society, that everybody is working towards this joint purpose, this joint job of new nationhood.
The planet is uninhabitable from the tropics south is the presumption. That's where we're headed. Imagine
I
this.
mean, not entirely uninhabitable, but yes, it's certainly for the huge populations that are there at the moment. It cannot manage these billions of people. No.
So the projections for population, you want numbers? Projections is we'll approach 10 billion by the middle of this century, and that will back up to 8 billion by the end of this century. A lot of the growth will come in Africa, which begins with disadvantages. But in any event, those are big numbers. There are extreme versions of what can happen if we do not manage our cities. And one is to reduce the population dramatically back to 1800s numbers. I don't think that's the future. We're much more disorganized than that. However, I learned from Gaia that this has already happened. These cities that welcome refugees or immigrants. There's one outside of Madrid called Parla. There's one in the Netherlands called Beer. I can't say the Dutch word, but it's Biglemermeer. And then Germany handled its refugee overflow in 2015. However, let's look to how we're going to feed people, because we have a sudden population moving north. We have damage to the vegetation that we depend upon right now, but we only use a certain small number of plants right now to feed. And we also invest a great deal in meat production, which is extremely inefficient. So Gaia, I smiled when you listed that there are cultures already eating insects. I note that I've listened to other speakers from Nature magazine, Science magazine. We can eat bacteria. We can reshape all of that. In other words, we can feed the planet in a completely different and much more nutritious style than we do right now. Is that a conversation at COP26, COP27? Are the people worried about climate change already anticipating we've got to feed the global north?
I mean, it's beginning, but it's at such a low level at the moment. I mean, what we're talking about is a complete overhaul in our food production, our global food production system. It's simply not working. I mean, to be clear, if everybody on the planet right now at 8 billion population was to eat the average diet of an American, well, that wouldn't work. We simply don't have enough food for that. You know, there are all sorts of health benefits for not doing that as well. We need to move to a more plant-based diet for a start, because our meat production system, this mass production of meat is terrible for biodiversity. It's a huge contributor to climate change. It's unhealthy the way we're doing it, and we simply couldn't provide enough protein, enough meat to feed a global population of 9 or 10 billion people anyway, with the amount of land we've got. So what we're looking at is a lot of the bread baskets, rice baskets that we have at the moment being out of action over the coming decades due to drought, due to extreme heat. Crop production is going to massively fall there. That's a huge problem. And that scientists are certainly looking at that. They're looking at different adaptations. And what it will mean is a switch to plant-based food. It doesn't mean a deprivation at all, because first of all, plants are a much more efficient way of feeding ourselves. But secondly, these meat replacements are actually, they've come on amazingly. I don't know, John, if you've tried any of these new artificial meats.
I'm not a good example, though, because my understanding of cuisine is I can't quite spell it. So,
well, some of them are really very convincing. I mean, it is like, you know, if bloody beef is your thing, I mean, I've eaten burgers which are extremely convincing. And, you know, it's enough. I don't think we will move 100% to a plant-based diet, but meat will become a lot more of a treat rather than something that we're eating.
Oh, Guy, I like the idea of eating insects for nutrition. I like that idea a great deal.
Well, I've eaten crickets and they're delicious. So, you know, once something's deep fried, it all tastes the same, right?
Yes, it's either chicken or near to chicken. The feeding the population that moves north means that we're going to have to rethink arable land. I just saw a picture in Nature magazine of how the forest has been reduced to plant soy. And I thought, that's stupid. Leave the forest alone and grows soy vertically. That's part of your city, is vertical farming.
Well, the problem is that a lot of that soy is not a bad product at all. The problem is that a lot of the forest destruction is being done to grow soy to feed cows, right? And then we eat the cow, and that's so inefficient. We only get about 10% of the original nutrition from that. It's much more effective to grow the soy and eat the soy, right? For humans to eat the soy. And to do that, we don't need to chop down all the forests.
We also damage biodiversity. That's a parallel story that Gaia is telling, that biodiversity and climate change go hand in hand. And
absolutely.
And that is a challenge for big thinkers, bigger than me. But I learned from a recent article in Nature magazine, our favorite, that a logged forest is more biodiverse than an old growth forest. It's quite fantastic that it has more opportunities for species to take advantage. Now, this is early study. I'm not proving it, but your book opens up the fact that we need to rethink the forest, the arable land, farming, what we feed on. Oh, and we have to also rethink water. Now,
yeah, and just back to that biodiversity study, I think what's really interesting about that is it shows the enormous potential that we have for restoration. You know, once we leave a place, if we've destroyed so many of these natural landscapes on our planet, we're at this critical crisis point where our civilizations, which depend entirely on the natural world being healthy, we've destroyed so much of this that if we were to leave them alone completely, much of this land, it would restore, and you know, it would take time to become old growth. But in the meantime, we're getting so many benefits from biodiversity restoration.
Let's go talk about restoration, because Gaia's book is wonderfully optimistic about the near future, not the 25th century. Let's talk about the 22nd. Nomad Century is the book. I'm John Batchelor with Gaia Vince, and we're now restoring a planet that's been damaged badly by climate change in the 20th century and the 21st century. And the restoration is technological, so I need Gaia to translate some of this. We have BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. We have good old-fashioned CCS, carbon capture and storage. We have ocean fertilization, wonderful story. Let's begin there. Ocean fertilization. We've got, what, 3/5 of the planet. So we've got a lot to work with. What does it look like, Gaia, and what benefit will we get from it?
Well, I mean, so at the moment, our oceans are already very depleted. They are 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial times. And that means coral reefs and other shell-building organisms really struggle to, they need a lot more energy to build their shells. It's much hotter. So, you know, coral reefs are on their way to extinction in the next couple of decades. It's an absolutely terrible story. But we can start the restoration process, and we need to start it now. So ocean fertilization is something that could work. At the moment, we haven't done nearly the trials that we need to do for it, and it's still very controversial. But oceans are naturally fertilized by this limiting factor, which is iron, which flows. It's blown off the deserts of the Sahara and the Namibian deserts into the ocean, where it fertilizes these microplankton, these algae, which are the basis of an enormous food chain, including things like whales. And this system was sort of self-perpetuating for, you know, before humans messed it up, basically. And we messed it up to start with by whaling. So we killed a lot of the whales. And what the whales did in this self-perpetuating cycle was eat a lot of these plankton, and then they would do their poo, and this poo would fertilize. For a start, it would fertilize more algae and other organisms, but it would also help bury a large amount of carbon in the floor of the ocean when these algae plankton die. So this was a really important cycle which we messed up with this enormous whaling. Well, whaling has now ceased, but whale populations are nowhere near the level they were at the beginning of the 20th century. So one proposal is to help boost this whole system by adding iron artificially. And this is something that happens periodically in geological history, where there are times when enormous amounts of desert sand have blown into the oceans and fertilized it much more, and you get these huge amounts of algae which then take in more carbon dioxide and actually cool the planet. So the idea is it would help suck out carbon dioxide and help cool the temperature of the earth.
Enhanced weathering, another wonderful idea going forward.
Well, this is less controversial, but again, it's a really important thing that happens naturally geologically, where some types of rock actually react with the carbon dioxide dissolved in the atmosphere, and they bind with it, and it's then washed down into the rivers and into the seabed, and it locks that carbon away. So the idea is to sprinkle those sorts of rocks, and these are things like olivines, across either crop fields, where they actually improve the production of crops, they improve the yields, or on beaches, and they're very pretty actually, they're sort of green, and that would increase the uptake of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, again cooling the atmosphere.
And geoengineering, exciting science fiction, but doable, especially at the parts of the globe that are going to be in extreme heat and extreme flooding and extreme drought. It's still controversial, but I've had it presented to me several times, for example, putting reflective bubbles on the surface of the ocean to increase the albedo. The one I liked all your choices, the one that most attracted me was probably the one that is going to strike everybody as foolishness: negative growth. We live in a culture and in a society where we do not account for the waste of energy and time and prosperity that we lavish on our ordinary lives. Is that imaginable, Gaia? Can we educate the planet to reduce the growth in order to protect the planet?
Well, so, growth is really important for our societies, for, it provides future for younger people, for the decades going forward. What we need to do is not negative growth, but we need to decouple economic growth from environmental destruction.
Oh, and very diplomatic. Already, you put it diplomatically.
Well, it's already starting to happen, it's already starting to happen. So I do have hope that some economies are already disassociating economic growth from environmental pollution and carbon emissions and environmental destruction of ecosystems. So it's possible. Let's hope. We don't have a choice, right?
No, I see that it's coming on. I do not know that I'll live to see the worst of the effects, but right now I can see in the retreat of the glaciers. For example, I tell you, mimosa, it blooms in Italy in February, customarily, but it's blooming now. Mimosa has moved north because of the warmer temperatures in Europe. So
nature migrates in response to environmental difficulties, and climate change is just another example of that. We must allow nature to migrate. We must allow people to migrate.
Nomad Century is the book. How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World is now. Gaia Vince is the author. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.